The alien general couldn't detach her war armor until a human touched it. The war had no good side. That was the first thing Do-Yun had learned when he joined the Human Coalition's medical division. He had signed up thinking he would save lives, and he did, but not in the clean, heroic way he had imagined as a young man growing up in Busan, watching old war films with his grandfather on rainy afternoons. The reality of war was blood, exhaustion, and paperwork. Lots of paperwork. He was 29 years old, lean and quiet, with dark eyes that noticed things other people missed. He had a habit of watching people before speaking to them, a trait that had made him a good medic and a poor conversationalist at parties. His colleagues liked him well enough. His patients trusted him immediately, which was what mattered. The war between the Human Coalition and the Varek Empire had been going on for 3 years by the time Do-Yun was stationed on Mira 9. 3 years of battles in deep space, on frozen moons, in the cold corridors of contested stations. Thousands dead on both sides, entire fleets reduced to floating debris. Neither side had won. Neither side had truly lost. They had simply bled each other until both were too tired to keep swinging. The ceasefire had come quietly, the way exhaustion always does. One morning the shooting stopped. Then the diplomats arrived. Then the neutral stations like Mira 9 began filling up with soldiers from both sides, all of them standing in the same corridors, eating in the same mess halls, pretending they had not been trying to kill each other a week ago. Do-Yun had been assigned to Mira 9's medical wing 6 months before the ceasefire. He had expected to spend his days treating coalition soldiers. He had not expected to be asked to monitor the health of a Varek general. Her name was Vale. He had heard the name before. Everyone in the coalition had. General Vale of the Varek Empire was not a rumor or an exaggeration. She was real. And she was every bit as terrifying as the reports suggested. She stood nearly 8 feet tall, with gray-blue skin and 4 arms, 2 of which ended in broad, heavy hands built for combat. Her eyes were a pale gold color that seemed to glow faintly in dim light. She had led the Varek fleet in 14 major engagements and had never lost a single one. She was the reason 3 coalition commanders had been relieved of their positions. She was the reason Do-Yun had spent many nights in surgery. And now she was standing in a corridor on Mira 9, and she could not take off her armor. The armor was not ordinary armor. Do-Yun had read the Coalition's intelligence files on Varek bioarmor the night before his assignment began, sitting alone in his small quarters, with a cold cup of tea going cold beside him. The files were dense and technical, written by people who had studied captured fragments of the armor rather than the living thing. But the basic idea was clear enough. Varek war generals did not wear armor the way humans wore a jacket. The armor grew with them. It was organic, partly living tissue, partly engineered material, and over years of service, it fused gradually with the nervous system of the warrior inside it. It could read the general's body. It could respond to signals from the nervous system. It tightened when the general was in combat. It protected the parts of the body that were most stressed. It had been designed over centuries to be the perfect shield, one that understood its wearer better than any external machine could. The problem was that it also knew when to stay on. The armor was built with one core function above all others. And in the days since the ceasefire, Vale's armor had decided that it was not yet safe for her to be unprotected. Every Varek technician on the station had tried to disengage it. They had used tools, codes, chemical signals, sonic frequencies. Nothing had worked. The armor's biological components were still running on a war setting, responding to something inside Vale that had not yet accepted that the war was over. She was, in the most literal sense, trapped inside herself. Do-Yun had been briefed on this by Commander Wu Jin, the Coalition's senior liaison officer on Mira 9. Wu Jin was a short, sharp-eyed man in his 50s, who delivered bad news the same way he delivered good news, calmly, without any change in expression. "She hasn't slept properly in at least a week," Wu Jin said, sliding a medical report across the table toward Do Yun. "The armor's internal sensors are transmitting data we managed to partially decode. Her body temperature is elevated. Heart rate is irregular. There are stress markers throughout her nervous system." Do Yun looked at the report. "She's in pain?" "Almost certainly. The armor wasn't designed to stay in full combat configuration for extended periods. It's pressing against her body in ways it shouldn't. Her own engineers believe if it stays locked much longer, it could begin causing damage to the tissue beneath. And her engineers can't get it off." "No, and she won't let our medical staff near her." Wu Jin paused. "She barely tolerates their presence in the same room." Do Yun looked up from the report. "So why me?" Wu Jin was quiet for a moment. "Because every senior medic we've sent has walked in there with equipment. Scanners, tools, injection kits. The moment she sees the equipment, she shuts down, becomes uncooperative." He looked at Do Yun steadily. "You have a record of working with difficult patients. Patients who didn't want help. I've read your case notes. You have a way of making people feel like you're not a threat." Do Yun sat with that for a moment. "I'm not being asked to treat her," he said slowly. "I'm being asked to get close enough that someone eventually can. You're being asked to observe. Nothing more. Don't push. Don't bring equipment the first day. Just go, introduce yourself, and see what happens." That evening, Do Yun walked to the corridor where Vale had been given a large holding room. The word room felt too small for the space, but it was the best Mira 9 could offer a being her size. 2 Varick guards stood outside. They looked at him with the particular expression of people who expected him to turn around and leave. He didn't. He showed his credentials, waited while they conferred in their own language, and was eventually allowed inside. The room was dim. Vale stood near the far wall, her back partially turned. The armor covered every part of her. It was dark, almost black, with a faint texture like overlapping scales, and it moved when she breathed, rising and falling with a slow mechanical rhythm. She did not turn when he entered. He stood near the door and said nothing for almost a full minute. Then, without turning, she spoke. Her translator implant rendered her words in flat, even standard. "You are the 4th one today." "I know," Do Yun said. "I'm sorry about that." She turned her head slightly, just enough to look at him from the corner of her eye. He didn't move toward her. He didn't take out anything. He just stood there, hands at his sides, and looked back at her without flinching. "I'm not here to fix anything tonight," he said. "I just wanted to see how you were doing." She stared at him for a long moment. Then she turned back to the wall, but she didn't tell him to leave. The alien general couldn't detach her war armor until a human touched it. Do Yun came back the next morning. He came at the same time, early, before the station's corridors filled with people, before the noise and the politics of the day began. The Varick guards outside the door had different faces now, a rotation, but their expression was the same as the pair from the night before. Vaguely suspicious, vaguely bored. They let him in without much argument, because his clearance was valid and he carried nothing alarming. Inside, the room was the same dim space it had been the evening before. Vale was standing in a different spot, closer to the center of the room now, and she turned slightly when he entered, which was already more acknowledgement than she had given him the first time. She said nothing. He walked to the corner of the room where a low bench had been placed, presumably for whoever was assigned to monitor her, and he sat down. He did not take out a scanner. He did not open a medical case. He had a small paper notebook in his coat pocket, a personal habit, something his mother had given him years ago, and he took it out and began writing his own notes in it, quietly, with a short pen. He could feel her watching him. After about 10 minutes, she spoke. "What are you writing?" Observations, he said, without looking up. A pause. About me? About everything, he said. I write things down so I don't forget them. My memory isn't as good as I'd like it to be. Another pause. Longer this time. Then, Varric generals are trained to remember everything. A lapse of memory in battle is a failure. Do-Yun looked up. That sounds exhausting. But something in the way she held herself shifted very slightly, like a door that had been nudged without opening. He looked back down at his notebook. This was the thing about Do-Yun that his colleagues either appreciated or found maddening, depending on the day. He was genuinely unhurried. Not in a strategic way, not because someone had told him that patience was a useful tool in difficult situations. He was unhurried because he actually believed that most things resolved better when you stopped pushing on them. He had learned this early, from a childhood in a noisy household with 2 older brothers and a grandmother who had survived things that should have broken her. His grandmother had never rushed anything in her life. She moved slowly, and she saw everything. He thought about her sometimes when he was sitting with a patient who didn't want to be helped. On the second day he brought food. Not for himself, or rather, not only for himself. He had researched what Varric could consume through the intake ports of their armor. It wasn't a complex answer. Certain nutrient compounds in liquid form, delivered through a small tube that connected to a port near the collarbone of the armor. The compound wasn't interesting, as food went. It didn't taste like anything he'd ever wanted to eat. But it was what she could take in, and she hadn't eaten properly in days. Her armor's internal sensors, still partially broadcasting on an open frequency that Coalition technicians had managed to partially decode, confirmed this. He set the container down on the bench beside him without comment. She looked at it. He went back to his notebook. After a while, she moved closer. She picked up the container. She stood with it for a moment, and then connected it to the intake port with a small mechanical click, and the container slowly emptied. He didn't say anything about it. He just kept writing. On the third day, she sat down. There was a large reinforced surface in the room that served as a chair for her. The station engineers had put it there quickly and not very elegantly, but it held her weight. She sat across from him, her armor still fully sealed, and she looked at him with those pale gold eyes for a long time before speaking. "You are not afraid of me," she said. It wasn't a question. It was something she was trying to understand. "I'm a little afraid of you," Do-Yun said honestly. "You're very large, and you have 4 arms, and your file says you've won 14 battles. That's objectively frightening." He thought it might be what passed for amusement among Varric. "Then why do you not show it?" He thought about this for a moment. "I learned a long time ago that showing fear in front of a patient usually makes things worse. Not because fear is bad. Fear is normal. But when a patient sees that you're afraid of them, they feel like a problem to be managed, not a person." Vale was quiet. "You see me as a person," she said, slowly, like she was testing the weight of the idea. "Yes," he said simply, "a person who's been in an armor suit for too long, and probably has a terrible headache, and hasn't eaten enough, and is in a position nobody trained her for." Her jaw tightened. "I am a general of the Varric Empire. I have commanded fleets. I have—" "I know," he said, not dismissively, not quickly, just gently. "That's not what I'm talking about." She stopped. The armor made a faint sound, a low vibration, like something inside it adjusting. Do-Yun had started learning to read those small sounds over the past few days, the way a medic learns to read a patient's breathing. The armor reacted to her. When she was tense, it tightened. When something surprised her, it made that faint low sound, like gears recalibrating. Right now, it was making that sound. He didn't push. He went back to his notebook. On the 4th day, his colleague Hayrim came to find him in the corridor before his morning visit. Hayrim was a xenobiologist, not military, not medical, but the kind of scientist who had dedicated her career to understanding how alien biology actually worked, rather than how humans assumed it worked. She was from Incheon, sharp and meticulous, with the kind of energy that made her seem like she was always 3 thoughts ahead of the conversation. "I've been looking at the armor data," she said, falling into step beside him. "I think I understand something." "Tell me," Do-yoon said. "The bio-armor doesn't just read physical stress. It reads emotional state. It's been calibrated over years of service to Vale's specific physiology. It knows her." Hayrim paused. "And right now, it thinks she's still at war." Do-yoon slowed his pace. "Because she thinks she's still at war." "Exactly." Hayrim looked at him. "The armor won't disengage until it reads something it identifies as safety. Not just absence of threat. Actual safety. And she's never been trained to feel that. Varick generals are conditioned from childhood to treat every environment as a potential combat zone." She paused again. "But something is changing in the data. The stress markers are still there, but they're slightly lower than they were 2 days ago." Do-yoon said nothing, but he kept walking toward her door. "What are you doing in there?" Hayrim asked. "Sitting," he said. She looked at him like he was being deliberately mysterious. He wasn't. It was just the truth. Inside the room, Vale was already seated when he arrived, which she hadn't been on any of the previous days. She had been waiting. He wasn't sure she realized it herself. He sat across from her and opened his notebook. "Tell me something," she said, before he could speak. He looked up. "What would you like to know?" Her gold eyes moved over his face slowly, like she was reading something written there. "Why do humans help things that cannot help them back?" It was such an unexpected question that he sat with it for a moment before answering. "We don't always. But when we do, I think it's because we know what it feels like to need help and not have it. It's hard to watch someone else in that place and do nothing." She looked at him for a long time. The armor made its low vibration sound again. Outside, in the corridor, one of the Varick engineers, who had been monitoring the armor's data feed, looked at his screen and frowned. Something had changed in the readings. He checked his instruments twice. The numbers were real. The armor's combat lock had loosened. Not released, not yet, but the grip had eased, just slightly, for the first time since the ceasefire had begun. He sent a message to his superior immediately. His superior sent a message to Woo Jin. Woo Jin read the message, set it down, and allowed himself one small, quiet breath of relief. The alien general couldn't detach her war armor until a human touched it. Word travels fast on a small station. By the 5th day, everyone on Mira 9, who had any connection to the Varick delegation, knew that the human medic had done something that 17 Varick engineers and 4 of their top biological technicians had failed to do. He hadn't removed the armor, not yet, but the data didn't lie. The combat lock had eased. The armor was responding differently. Something had changed inside Vale, and it had happened in a room where a young man from Busan sat quietly with a paper notebook and didn't ask for anything. The Varick engineers were unhappy about this. Not ungrateful. They were professionals, and they understood that the result mattered more than the method. But unhappy in the specific way that experts become unhappy when a problem they couldn't solve is gently resolved by someone with no expertise in their field. They requested a meeting with Hayrim, because Hayrim was the closest thing Mira 9 had to someone who could explain it in scientific language they respected. The meeting took place in a small conference room on the station's lower level. 3 Varick engineers sat on one side of the table. Hayrim sat on the other side, with a datapad and a cup of tea that she didn't touch. Do-yoon had been asked to attend, but had declined because he had a morning visit scheduled and he wasn't going to miss it. The lead engineer was named Baek-han, a human coalition observer, assigned to liaise with the Varick technical team. He was broad-shouldered and methodical, the kind of person who never wrote anything down because he never forgot anything. He had been working alongside the Varek engineers since the ceasefire, and had developed a working relationship with them built on mutual professional respect and very little warmth. He opened the meeting with a direct question, translated through the room's interpreter system for the Varek engineers. "Can you explain what is happening with the armor?" Hayrim set down her datapad and folded her hands. "The bio-armor is functioning correctly," she said. "That's the first thing to understand. It is not malfunctioning. It is doing exactly what it was designed to do. It is protecting General Vale." One of the Varek engineers made a short, impatient sound. "It is trapping her." "From its perspective, those are the same thing," Hayrim said. "The armor was built to respond to the General's internal state. Over years of service, it has learned her physiology in great detail. It knows when she is resting and when she is ready to fight. It knows when she is injured and when she is well, and it makes decisions based on what it reads." She paused. "Right now, it reads that she is not safe, and so it stays on." "We know this," the engineer said. "We have been trying to override the safety protocol." "You can't override it from the outside," Hayrim said simply. "The safety protocol doesn't respond to external input. It responds to her. The only thing that will disengage the armor is a genuine change in her internal state. Not a simulated one, not a chemical one, a real one." There was a short silence. Bacon leaned forward slightly. "And the medic is creating that change." "He's not creating it," Hayrim said. "He's allowing it. There's a difference." She picked up her datapad and turned it toward them, showing the stress marker data tracked over the past 5 days. The downward trend was visible, even to someone who didn't understand the specific metrics. General Vale's nervous system has been running at combat levels for years. Not just since the ceasefire, for years. Varek military conditioning suppresses the body's natural relaxation responses. Generals are trained to treat any environment as a potential threat. That conditioning is very effective in combat, but it means the body never truly rests. She set the pad down. The armor learned this pattern. It adapted to it. It began treating high alert status as Vale's baseline, her normal. And so it stayed in combat configuration, because that was what her body told it to expect. The Varek engineers exchanged a look. "Do-yun sits with her," Hayrim continued. "He doesn't demand anything. He doesn't bring instruments that remind her of being examined. He doesn't treat her like a problem to be solved. And slowly, very slowly, her nervous system is doing something it hasn't been allowed to do in a very long time. It's starting to come down from combat level." She looked at them steadily. "The armor is reading that change, and it's beginning to respond." One of the Varek engineers was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, through the interpreter, "You are saying that our most decorated general is being calmed by a human medic, sitting in a room, doing nothing." "Doing nothing is doing something," Hayrim said. "Humans have entire medical fields built around it." The engineer didn't have an answer to that. Bacon walked back to the medical wing afterward and found Hayrim in her lab, pulling up more data on her screen. He stood in the doorway for a moment. "Do you think it'll actually work?" he asked. "The armor actually coming off?" Hayrim didn't look up. "I think if Vale lets herself feel safe, truly feel it, not just think it, yes, the armor will release." She paused. "The question is whether she can get there. She's been running on adrenaline and conditioning for so long that the idea of letting her guard down might feel like dying." Bacon nodded slowly. "And Do-yun understands that?" "I don't think he thinks about it in those terms," Hayrim said. "I think he just sees someone who's tired and in pain, and he's sitting with her, which is probably exactly why it's working." Meanwhile, in the holding room, Do-yun was having a different kind of morning. Vale had started talking. Not about the war, not directly. She talked about the Varek homeworld, about the sound the wind made in the high mountain regions where she had grown up. She talked about her training, about the first time she had put on a junior version of the bio-armor at the age of 12 and how heavy it had felt. She talked about her commanders and what they had expected of her. He asked small questions when she paused. Not probing questions, not clinical questions, just the kind of questions that kept a conversation alive. He asked what the mountains looked like. He asked what the training food had tasted like. He asked if she had been scared the first time she put on the armor. She stopped at that question. Fear was not permitted, she said. But were you? He asked quietly. She was still for a long time. I was 12, she said. The armor was cold. It pressed on my shoulders. I did not know if it would learn to recognize me. A pause. I was afraid it would never let me go. The sentence sat in the air between them. Do-Yun didn't say anything for a moment. Then gently, and now it won't. She turned her head away. But the armor made its low vibration sound again, and this time it was longer than before. Not the sound of recalibration. Something older, as if some part of the living material that had fused itself to her body over decades was remembering what it had been built to do. Not just protect her from the world outside, but protect her from the damage of carrying too much for too long. In the monitoring station down the corridor, the Varric engineer watching the data feeds sat up straight. Every stress marker had dropped simultaneously. Not a little, not the gradual trickle of the past few days, all of them, at once, falling towards something that looked like rest. He reached for his communication device with a hand that was not entirely steady. He had been an armor engineer for 20 years. He had never seen this reading before. He had been told, theoretically, that it was possible. Every engineer knew the design specifications, but that was theory. They knew what the armor would do if a general ever reached a true state of internal safety. He had just never expected to see it in his lifetime. He sent the alert to the full Varric technical team. Then he sat back and stared at the data, and thought about a 12-year-old girl putting on cold armor, and being afraid it would never let her go. And somehow, against all expectation, being proven right for 30 years, until a human with a paper notebook sat down and didn't leave. The alien general couldn't detach her war armor until a human touched it. On the 6th day, Do-Yun almost didn't go. He had been awake since early morning, not because of the case, but because of an emergency 2 levels down. A coalition soldier had gone into cardiac distress in the night, and Do-Yun had been the duty medic. He had spent 4 hours in the medical bay, working, and by the time the soldier was stable, it was nearly dawn. He went back to his quarters, sat on his cot, and looked at the ceiling, and thought seriously about sleeping for 3 hours before his shift. But he got up, washed his face, and went to the holding room. He wasn't sure why. It wasn't a medical obligation. His role with Vale was officially listed as observational. He wasn't her primary care provider. He had no formal treatment plan in place, and nobody would have questioned him if he had taken the morning to rest. Wu Jin had even suggested 2 days ago that Do-Yun was spending more time in that room than his duties technically required. He went anyway. The guards let him in. The room was the same dim space it always was, but this time, Vale was not standing. She was seated on the reinforced surface that served as her chair, and her posture was different from any posture he had seen in the previous days. She wasn't holding herself like a soldier at attention. She was leaning forward slightly, her upper arms resting on her knees, her lower arms loose at her sides. The armor still covered her completely, but even the armor looked different. Not softer exactly, but less rigid. The way a clenched fist looks different from an open hand, even before it is fully opened. She looked up when he came in, and something in her face shifted in a way he was still learning to read. He thought it might be relief. He sat down in his usual spot. "You look tired," she said. "I was up with a patient," he said. She watched him. "Is the patient well?" "He'll be fine. Do-yoon said. It was a close thing, but he'll be fine. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something he hadn't expected. I am sorry you had a difficult night. He looked at her. She looked back at him steadily, as if she had not just said something that would have been unthinkable between a Varick general and a coalition medic 6 months ago, on either side of the war. Thank you, he said. He opened his notebook. He didn't write anything in it immediately. He just held it, the way he sometimes held it when he was tired, like a familiar weight. I have been thinking, Vale said, after a while. He looked up. You told me, some days ago, about your grandmother. You said she survived things that should have broken her. He had said that. He hadn't thought she was paying close attention when he said it. He had been talking quietly, filling the silence, the way he sometimes did. Yes, he said. How did she survive? He thought about it. It wasn't a simple question, and she wasn't asking it simply. She was asking it the way someone asks a question when they're really asking about themselves. She used to say that the key was not pretending things didn't hurt, he said slowly. She said the people who didn't survive were the ones who spent all their energy pretending. The ones who survived were the ones who let themselves feel how heavy it was, and then figured out how to keep walking anyway. Vale looked at him for a long time. That is not what we are taught, she said. I know, he said. We are taught that the weight does not exist, that to acknowledge it is weakness, that a general who feels the weight of her losses is already failing her soldiers. That must be very lonely, Do-yoon said quietly. Her jaw tightened. Her upper hands pressed against her knees. The armor hummed, faintly. He waited. I lost 11,000 soldiers in the Battle of Rhea Station, she said. It came out controlled, precise, the way she said most things, but underneath it there was something old and heavy. It was a strategic success. We held the station. The Varick command regarded it as a victory. A pause. I have not spoken of it to anyone. 11,000, Do-yoon said quietly. 11,241, she said. I know each number. I was trained to retain the data. Do you know their names? Some, she said. The ones I served with longest, the ones who had been with me from the early campaigns. You are going to ask me how I carried that. I'm going to ask if you ever put it down, he said. She was still for so long that the room felt very quiet. No, she said finally. Just that one word. But it carried the weight of 30 years. The armor made a sound. Not the small calibration sound that Do-yoon had learned in the past week. This was deeper. A vibration that he could feel faintly in the air, low and slow, like something very old settling into a new position. The surface of the armor, which had been rigid and sealed and completely unbroken for 6 days, shifted, just slightly. The overlapping scale-like plates around her shoulder, separated by a fraction, barely visible, the width of a finger, and a very faint light came from somewhere beneath them. Warm, dim, amber, the bioluminescent material that lived inside the armor's inner layers, usually completely hidden. Do-yoon saw it and said nothing. He didn't pick up his scanner. He didn't move toward her. He stayed exactly where he was, and he looked at her, and he waited. I am very tired, Vale said, not dramatically, not as a complaint, simply as a statement of fact, the kind of fact that takes years to be ready to say out loud. I know, he said. The armor has not let me sleep properly since the ceasefire. She looked down at her own hands. I think it is afraid to let me sleep, because when it reads my body asleep, it doesn't know if I am resting, or if I am... She stopped. Vulnerable, Do-yoon said gently. Yes, she looked at him. It has protected me for so long that it doesn't know how to stop. It doesn't know that protection and rest can exist at the same time. That I could be safe and asleep simultaneously. Do-yoon was quiet for a moment. Then Carefully, he said, "What if you told it? Not in a command, but the way you'd tell someone you trust." She looked at him strangely. "It is armor," she said. "It's been fused to your nervous system for 30 years, he said. "You said yourself it learned you. You said it knew when you were afraid." He paused. "If it learned to read your fear, maybe it can learn to read something else." She sat with that. Outside in the corridor, in the Varric monitoring station, every engineer on the technical team was now present, crowded around screens, watching the data in near total silence. Bei Khan stood at the back of the room. Hei Rim stood beside him. The numbers on the screens were doing something none of them had seen before. Inside the room, Doyun heard the sound. It was slow and resonant, deeper than anything the armor had produced in the past 6 days. Not a malfunction, not an alarm, a release. A long, steady mechanical sound, like a door that had been locked for decades, finally being opened from the inside. The shoulder plates separated fully, then the chest section, the arm sections, the back plates. One by one, with careful mechanical precision, the armor opened along its seams, not falling apart, but unfolding, moving aside, plate by plate, revealing the gray-blue skin beneath. Vale sat very still. Her hands, all 4 of them, were visible now, bare, for the first time in days. The armor settled around her, like a loosened shell, resting against her body but no longer pressing, no longer locked. She exhaled. It was a long, shaking breath, and it was the most human sound he had heard from her. He didn't clap. He didn't call for anyone. He just sat there, and he let her have the moment, and he watched her face while she breathed actual air without a filter for the first time in 6 days. She looked at him, and in her pale gold eyes, which had looked like a weapon every time he had seen them, there was something different now. It looked, very simply, like rest. H1. The alien general couldn't detach her war armor until a human touched it. HR. News spread across Mira 9 the way news always spread on a small station. Fast, slightly distorted, and impossible to contain. By midday, everyone knew. Coalition soldiers who had spent 3 years fighting the Varric Empire sat in the mess hall and talked about it in low voices. Some of them found it strange, almost uncomfortable. The idea that the general who had nearly broken their fleet at Rhea Station was sitting in a room a few corridors away, without her armor, breathing real air, and a medic from their side had helped make it happen. A few of them were skeptical. A few were openly moved by it, without fully understanding why. The Varric delegation was harder to read. Vale's second-in-command, a senior officer named Rio, had been handling the diplomatic responsibilities during Vale's incapacitation. He was calmer than Vale, shorter, quieter, with a precise and formal manner that made him very effective in meetings and very difficult to know. He received the news about the armor from the chief engineer without any visible reaction, asked 2 factual questions, and then dismissed everyone from the room, so he could be alone with the information for a few minutes. What he did in those minutes, nobody knew. When he came back out, his expression was the same as always. But he requested a private meeting with Commander Wu Jin the same afternoon, and he arrived at that meeting without his usual formal guard escort, just himself and an interpreter, which was, for a Varric officer of his rank, an extraordinary informality. He was the kind of person who noted everything. "I understand," Rio said when they were seated, "that a human medic is responsible for what happened this morning. Medic Doyun has been spending time with General Vale, yes?" Wu Jin said carefully. "He was not assigned as a medical officer to the general. He was assigned as an observer." "Correct." He exceeded his assignment. Wu Jin met the officer's eyes. He sat in a room and listened to her. If that exceeded his assignment, then his assignment was too narrow. Rio looked at him for a moment. Then he said in a slightly different tone, I am not criticizing. I am trying to understand. Wu Jin relaxed slightly. Then I'll try to explain. He explained it as Heirin had explained it to him, simply, without unnecessary technical language. The armor was biological. It read Vale's internal state. Vale had been running at war-level stress for so long that her body had forgotten any other setting. Do-yun had not fixed her. He had simply been present with her, consistently and without demand, until her body remembered what it felt like to not be in danger. Rio listened without interrupting. When Wu Jin finished, the Varric officer was quiet for a moment. "We have nothing like this in our training," he said finally. "What your medic did. We do not have a word for it in the formal military language. There is a word in the older dialects. It is something like companion standing, or witness presence. It was considered an outdated concept. It was removed from the military code 2 centuries ago, because it was seen as incompatible with the demands of command." "What did it mean?" Wu Jin asked. "To stand with someone in difficulty. Not to solve the difficulty, not to manage it, just to be present so that the person is not alone in it." Rio paused. It was considered inefficient. And now? Rio looked at the table. And now our most decorated general is breathing free air for the first time in 6 days, because a human practiced a concept we removed from our military code 200 years ago. He paused again. "I am not sure what conclusion to draw from that. Maybe that efficiency isn't always the most efficient solution," Wu Jin said. Rio looked at him, and something moved through his expression that was not quite a smile, but was close. The formal peace discussions had been slow before that day. Both delegations had been circling the details with the careful distance of people who weren't sure they trusted the ground they were walking on. There were territorial questions, questions about resources, questions about the coalition soldiers still held in Varric processing stations, and the Varric soldiers still held in coalition facilities. The meetings had been productive but cold. The kind of productive that happens when everyone is being very careful, and nobody is being very honest. Vale changed that. She attended the next diplomatic session herself, 3 days after her armor released. She was still in the armor. She would wear it for some time yet, her engineers said, while it adjusted to a new baseline, and she recovered from the physical strain of having been trapped inside it. But it was no longer locked. The difference was visible. She moved differently. She sat differently. She occupied the room without filling it with threat. She spoke first, which was not the protocol. Protocol said the session chair opened. She spoke first anyway. "I have a proposal," she said, and her voice through the translation system was the same precise, level voice it always was. But there was something under it now that hadn't been there before. "I propose that we handle these negotiations differently from this point forward. I propose that instead of each delegation presenting its maximum position and retreating from it slowly, we each present our actual concerns, the real ones, the ones we have not said aloud, and we address those." There was a silence in the room. One of the human diplomats cleared his throat. "That is a somewhat unconventional approach, General." "Yes," she said. "I have been told that humans do things unconventionally. I am beginning to think it is worth trying." She looked briefly at the corner of the room where Do-yun was standing. He had no formal role in the diplomatic sessions, but Wu Jin had asked him to be present in case Vale needed medical support. She looked at him for just a moment, and then she looked back at the table. "My actual concern," she said, "is that this ceasefire will hold for 2 years, and then collapse, and we will begin again. My actual concern is that neither side has addressed the thing that started this war. And without addressing it, all of this is a pause, not an ending." The room was very quiet. And then, slowly, the coalition's lead diplomat leaned forward and said, our actual concern is the same. The treaty was signed 9 days later. It was not a perfect treaty. No treaty ever is. There were provisions that satisfied no one completely, and there were details that would take years to resolve. And there would be difficult moments in the years ahead when people on both sides questioned whether it had been worth it. That was the nature of peace. It was not a destination. It was a practice, like medicine, like patience. He stood near the back of the room with Hayrim, who had spent the past week writing a paper on Varic bioarmor that would go on to change the field of xenobiology considerably, and with Bekhan, who had managed to develop something approaching a genuine friendship with 2 of the Varic engineers over the course of many very long nights looking at data together. Vale signed the treaty with a stylus held in her upper right hand. The signature she made was precise and deliberate. No hesitation, no flourish. The mark of a person who had made a decision and stood behind it. After the ceremony, when most of the room had emptied into the corridor for the formal reception, she crossed the room to where Do-Yun was standing. He waited. She stood in front of him, a full head and a half taller, the armor resting around her like something that had finally learned to trust her too. "I am told," she said, "that in your culture, when someone does something for you that they did not have to do, you say thank you." "We do," he said. "I have been thinking about whether it is appropriate for a Varic general to say such things." "What did you decide?" She looked at him with those pale gold eyes. "I decided that I spent 30 years deciding things based on what was appropriate for a Varic general," she said. "Perhaps I will try deciding something based on what is true instead." She inclined her head, the Varic gesture of respect between equals, not between commanders and subordinates, and she said, "Thank you, Do-Yun." He nodded back. "Get some sleep, General," he said quietly. Something moved in her face, the thing that might have been amusement, which he had learned to recognize over the past 2 weeks. It was there, and it was more certain than it had ever been before. She turned and walked away. In the official Varic record of the peace negotiations, the ceasefire was attributed to strategic recalculation and mutual military exhaustion. It was documented carefully and thoroughly, with dates and fleet positions and economic projections. In Vale's private record, which was not official, and which she wrote by hand in the older Varic script that fewer and fewer people still used, the peace was attributed to something different. To a human who had come into her room with nothing but a paper notebook and had stayed every morning without being asked to. She wrote the old word for it in the older dialect, companion standing. And then she closed the journal, and for the first time in 30 years, she slept.